Welcome to tonight's webinar on planning for nature. This will be an introduction to wildlife and development. The word development has become something of a buzzword in recent years, especially with the growing number of proposed infrastructure projects, housing schemes, new towns, etc. So I suppose we wanted to use this webinar as an opportunity to explain what policies and legislation exists to protect our remaining wild places, our remaining habitats and wildlife, and most importantly, how you can help. For those of you who haven't met me yet, my name is Becky Williams, and I'm a Wild Network Officer at Cheshire Wildlife Trust. The Wild Network is a community of people from all across our region who really care about nature and are doing their bit to help wildlife recover locally. So for those in the Wild Network, we offer all sorts of training, workshops, webinars like this one, just lots of different ways to learn more about how we can all collectively help our declining wildlife and habitats. And I'll have some more information at the end, but you can find us on Facebook. We're at Cheshire's Wild Network, or if you haven't already, you can also sign up to our mailing list for our monthly newsletters through the Cheshire Wildlife Trust website, where I send all sorts of upcoming events, workshops, guides, funding bids, you name it. Hopefully something for everyone, I'd like to think. So yeah, before I introduce our speaker today, just a gentle reminder that all the contents in this presentation cannot be reproduced or used by anyone without express permission from Cheshire Wildlife Trust. And please feel free to get in touch for more information. So I am really delighted to introduce my colleague and our speaker this evening, Melusine Veldi. She is our wonderful planning and advocacy officer at Cheshire Wildlife Trust, and she spends most of her days working tirelessly behind the scenes, constantly speaking up for wildlife that might be impacted by harmful developments. And she's wonderful, and we're so grateful that she's given up her evening to educate us tonight and share what she knows. So over to you, Melusine.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here today, and thanks to Becky for organizing this wonderful webinar series. So my name is Melusine Veldi. I'm the Planning and Advocacy Officer at the Cheshire Wildlife Trust. As you might notice from my accent, I'm originally from the US, but I moved to the UK a few years ago to do my master's in ecology, evolution, and conservation. And then I moved up to Cheshire because I had some friends in the area. I've been here a little over 2 years now, and I've gotten to know Cheshire surprisingly well through my work in the time that I've been here. So when people ask, what does planning and advocacy even mean? I usually say that I advocate for wildlife where it's impacted by development. So I spend a lot of time looking at different planning applications and development projects to assess what their impact on local wildlife is going to be. And then I work in different ways to try to make sure that those impacts are minimized and compensated for, and even sometimes hopefully that they contribute to nature's recovery. So I'll first do a quick refresher on the importance of nature, since it really informs the work that we do as a trust and then also in my planning role. So we often forget as a society that we get lots of benefits and ecosystem services from keeping wildlife in good condition. We get global health benefits, so pollination of our crops by insects and pollinators that are disappearing at rates that we can't even keep track of. Quality of our drinking water, because peatlands and wetlands filter out contamination and pollution from agriculture and industrial plants. And then healthy ecosystems also keep infectious diseases in check, which is likely to be one of the effects of climate change. We also get loads of resources, so wood for building and furniture, etc., medicine from plants, and textiles for clothes and other fabrics. And then we get mitigation from the effects of climate change. One of the biggest effects is climate instability leading to floodings and droughts. But peatlands and wetlands trap and collect rainwater, which would otherwise be in our homes and roads. Trees and plants are really good at cooling during heat waves, especially in urban areas. And then peatlands, forests, grasslands, they all sequester carbon. So they take CO2 from the atmosphere and store it in the ground. But we only really get these benefits if nature is in good condition. So the illustration on the left is from the Making Space for Nature report from 2010, where Sir John Lawton, coined the term or the phrase bigger, better, more, and joined up. And that's become a foundational ecological principle that informs how we're trying to improve habitats. So most remaining habitats in Cheshire are small, fragmented, and in poor condition, which makes it really difficult for the species that are relying on them to thrive. So nature recovery efforts are really focused on getting more land for nature, improving quality, connecting it all up to create a healthy network. So some habitats are more important for wildlife than others, and we call them priority habitats. So some host lots of good or rare or endangered species, which we call priority species. So like bats, great crested newts, water voles, which have more local and national protections than some more common species. Other priority habitats give lots of ecosystem services. So like traditional orchards, for example, are really good for pollinators and lichens. Hedgerows provide linear corridors throughout the landscape, and they sequester carbon as well. And then some priority habitats are particularly difficult to replace if they're destroyed. So we call those irreplaceable habitats. So those are peatlands, for example, ancient woodlands, and veteran trees. So these priority and irreplaceable habitats are slightly better protected, and they're the ones that we prioritize in our advocacy and in our nature recovery work. So we know that nature is good, but it's been declining for centuries, with particularly catastrophic declines in the last 50 years. 1 out of 6 species is at risk of extinction in the UK, and that's due to a variety of threats, such as climate change, where unpredictable weather patterns, warmer average temperatures make it harder for species that require consistent seasons. We also have the unsustainable use of non-renewable resources, which leaves land in poor condition and difficult to use for species that need it. Air, water, and soil pollution degrade habitats. Invasive non-native species, which overtake native species and wreak havoc on their ecosystems. And then habitat loss generally due to agriculture and new developments. So my job focuses on protecting wildlife from the impacts of development, which comes in many forms, and all of which have the potential to be damaging. So we get some small developments, sometimes down to 5 houses or a small barn, for example. But if they're on existing habitat or a local wildlife site, for example, then we have to intervene and send comments or an objection in to the planning officer. But most of the projects I deal with are large housing developments, so like 50 to 200 houses, sometimes as large as 500 or 1,000. And obviously those have the potential to impact a lot of land due to their size. But they also represent a good opportunity for nature recovery if the developers are amenable to that. So more and more we've been seeing large developments incorporating a big area of meadow or woodland planting and ponds across the development, native hedgerows, etc. And when these developments are on arable fields, which aren't very good for wildlife anyway, they can actually be a win-win when done correctly, where we get more housing and we get some more habitats in areas where there aren't really any to start with. We've also seen some master plans for town-sized developments. So, for example, one of the ones we've been consulted on for a while now is the New Carrington project in Trafford, where they're building a whole new town, basically. And we've been advising them on how to incorporate habitats into their green infrastructure to provide a boost for nature in the area. The tough thing about that project is that the area is traditionally a peat moss, so there's still a lot of peat underground, even though above ground it's mostly arable fields. But there are also pockets of woodlands that will hopefully be retained, buffered, enhanced, but again, it depends if it's done well and if the developers are sensitive to the existing wildlife. It's a bit hard to tell how that's going to go at this stage, but we'll be advocating for positive design as much as we can. And then we have national significant infrastructure projects, which we informally call NSIPs, which can be solar and wind farms, gas pipelines, motorways or rail lines, etc. So unlike the housing development applications, which I've just discussed, which get submitted to the local planning authority, these large-scale infrastructure applications get submitted to the planning inspectorate for approval. So that's kind of one level higher. And that's because it's a longer process, usually a much bigger application because they have to submit much more intensive reports, and also because sometimes they span multiple local authorities at once. So in the last few years, we've gotten a flurry of NSIPs because Cheshire and the Northwest in general are poised to be a hotspot for infrastructure and renewable energy projects. And actually, while that's really good for our net zero ambitions in the UK, they can be just as damaging to nature as anything else. And in fact, sometimes more so because the need for net zero is used to justify the damage to wildlife. So one of the things we have a hard time conveying in our advocacy work is that the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis are intertwined. So addressing one by making the other worse just isn't a solution. So for example, in the last few years, we've been involved in the Frodsham Solar Farm, which is set to be extremely damaging to the Frodsham marshes. The HyNet and peak cluster carbon dioxide and hydrogen pipelines, which you may have heard about, that cover a lot of land. And then the Mersey Tidal Barrage, which we're currently running a campaign around to call for an independent review due to the potential damage to the internationally protected Mersey estuary. So these are really massive developments, and because of their scale and fewer regulations, they have the potential to damage entire ecosystems. Fortunately, there is already some policy and legislation to provide protections for nature and wildlife and to back up our advocacy work. So this is within the framework of what we call the planning system, which is set up to ensure that development happens in the right place and in the right way. So at a very local level, we have the neighborhood plan, which provides an opportunity for parishes to set out how development should happen in their area. So they obviously can't say that development shouldn't happen at all, as much as they'd love to, but they can write their own policies to influence where and how development occurs in their parish. So from a wildlife point of view, that can mean providing protections for certain habitats and local wildlife sites against development. So one of the services that we offer at the Trust is to produce a natural environment report for parish councils to use to inform their ecological policies. And the main output of that report is a wildlife corridors map, which shows all the important spots for wildlife and the network of connecting habitats across the parish. And often the neighborhood plan will include that map and have a policy that says that development can't negatively impact those sites and corridors. So it uses local knowledge to protect core wildlife sites. So at the local authority level, we have the local plan. So this is a set of policies and allocations, often accompanied by supplementary planning documents that set out the ways in which development should be sensitive to the local environment, whether that's historic character, landscape, ecology. So the policies take into account local needs and constraints, and the allocations determine which areas of land are best suited for different types of land use and development. So these local plans take years to prepare, and that process includes multiple consultation periods for input from the public and various stakeholders. So we usually go through the policies to determine whether they're adequately protecting wildlife, which is really important because once they're set, those are the policies that we use to back up our objections against certain developments. And we also look through the allocations that are being proposed to make sure that they're not on local wildlife sites or completely covered in priority habitat. So then at the national level, we have the Wildlife and Countryside Act of 1981, which established protections for wild species, and then the National Planning and Policy Framework, which sets out how development should happen and how local authorities should regulate development. So it's a bit more top level, but it ensures that regulation is consistent around the country. And it also includes some protection for wildlife, particularly for protected species and habitats and designated sites. And then finally, we have the Environment Act of 2021, which created new commitments to the natural environment after the exit from the European Union. So in particular, it sets up two big pieces of legislation, which are biodiversity net gain and the local nature recovery strategies. So first I'll go through biodiversity net gain, which you may have heard about in the last few years. The idea is for developers to fund nature recovery by providing at least a 10% net gain in biodiversity for new developments. So the diagram illustrates how it works. So if a development results in a woodland being cut down, that's a net loss in biodiversity. If the woodland is cut down and replaced elsewhere, like for like, then there's no net loss. And if the woodland is cut down, replaced, and then additional trees are planted in the new development, that's a net gain. Obviously, in practice, it's not that simple, and Natural England have devised a metric to try to quantify biodiversity for this purpose. So for a given habitat, it takes into account how important and rare that habitat is, its size and condition, the time it takes to fully establish, and whether it's in an ecological corridor already. So the metric is used to figure out how much biodiversity there is within the red line boundary of a development site. And it's used to figure out how many biodiversity units the developer needs to compensate for. So compensation can be achieved in 3 ways, although there is a hierarchy in the way that it should be done. So ideally, the gains for nature are on the site of the development. So for example, a woodland or a wetland is planted next to the houses, or there's a meadow across the development. If that's not possible or doesn't compensate enough for the habitats that were originally there, then gains can be off-site in the local area or on land owned elsewhere by the developer. And finally, if on-site or off-site gains are not possible for some reason, then they have to buy statutory credits from the government, which then fund conservation projects around the country. But those are really expensive, so I haven't seen very many projects where that's required. So it's pretty easy to see the ways in which, in theory, BNG provides a financial incentive for developers to protect and create habitats. So if there's a priority habitat on the site to start with, it's going to be less expensive for the developer to retain it and incorporate it into the scheme than to just destroy it. And it'll also be less expensive to design the project that way from the start, rather than have to figure out what to do about the biodiversity at the end of the project. So in practice, there's a really big range of ways in which developers are taking this up. So we've seen schemes where they try to cram as many houses on the site as possible and just compensate for the losses elsewhere. But there are also schemes that we've seen that have really incorporated nature into their design and achieved, a 50% net gain in biodiversity. So as an example, there was a solar farm proposed on some arable fields near Malpas that had a whole area of peat where they were going to put the solar panels. And then they were proposing a grassland compensation area elsewhere in the development. So we sent in an objection, and then they actually reached out to us to see how they could change the design to make it better for biodiversity. And they ended up changing the grassland area to a wetland area and moving it to the area of peat to try to preserve that resource and keep all that carbon stored in the ground. So that's an example of developers working with us to make their design more positive for nature. So the other big thing that came out of the Environment Act was the local nature recovery strategies. So these are county level strategies that consist of a statement of biodiversity priorities, including the habitats and species to focus on. And then that's accompanied by a map of areas in the county that can be targeted for nature recovery efforts. So, for example, where trees and hedgerows could be planted, where grasslands and meadows can be restored. And fundamentally, it's a map of areas where we can improve nature, target funding for conservation work, and create wildlife corridors to connect the habitats to each other. So the idea is also for it to work with BNG by encouraging gains in those areas that have already been identified. So the Cheshire and Mornington LNRS was published in November. So the local authorities will be leading on the implementation of the strategy to make sure that it's embedded in local planning in a way that really contributes to nature's recovery. So now that you have all of that context of the importance of wildlife, the types of development, and the policies that exist, hopefully you can start to see how that comes together in the advocacy work that we do around planning. So a big part of the job is responding to public consultations. So I spend a lot of time on the planning portals to look through applications that have been put in and to determine whether they might be damaging to nature. And if I've judged that they are, that they haven't done everything they could do to avoid habitats, that they haven't filled out their BNG metric properly, or that they're not in line with local policies, then I'll write up an objection and send it to the planning case officer to encourage them to either ask for more information or to deny the application. Our approach for local plans and allocations is a bit different, where it's more of a suggestion or recommendation to the local authorities to add or reword a policy to make the protections for wildlife more robust, or to remove an allocation because, for example, no matter how well designed the scheme is, the location would make it inherently damaging to nature. So we also do a lot of work with developers ahead of their applications. So many of the larger schemes will do their own public consultations. So that's a good opportunity to talk to them about their design, about their plans for habitat creation and BNG, and to try to influence the scheme to make sure it's as positive for nature as it can be. So, for example, we advocate for existing wildlife sites to be buffered with additional habitat creation, for wildlife corridors to be integrated throughout the development so that natural areas are connected, and for additional open green space to be included and to be managed in a way that's beneficial to biodiversity. So you can see in the image on the slide, this is an example of a well-designed development where the ancient woodland to the west is buffered. There are wildlife areas throughout with a variety of habitats. This development actually got denied for being, quote, inappropriate development in the greenbelt, which is kind of a shame because it's one of the better designs that I've seen. So then we also work closely with the local authorities as well. So many of them have biodiversity officers whom we liaise with regularly to discuss biodiversity issues. And they're a good point of contact for us to express our concerns and get in touch with other decision makers in the local council. And I've also sometimes talked directly with planning case officers, and we've also been in contact with councillors who might have an interest in a particular application. So that's kind of an overview of the planning work that we do at the Trust. We're going to do a little poll as a break from listening to me talk on, and then I'll go through the ways in which you can help advocate for wildlife as members of the public and community groups. So I think Becky's going to get the poll up. Hopefully that works. Oh, nice.
Fingers crossed that if everyone can see that, hopefully.
So yeah, the idea is to let us know if you've ever responded to a planning application whether that's for planning application or policy consultation, participated in your area's neighborhood plan, or joined or organized a campaign against a development. Spoiler alert, these are the things that I will be encouraging you to do to advocate for wildlife. So please have a think, and we're really curious to see what kind of engagement in the planning system you have all been doing already.
So far, 52% of people on this call have responded to a planning consultation, which is great.
Excellent.
29% have participated in the area's local neighborhood plan, also great. And 21% have joined or organized a campaign against a development. That's great. Any more responses? Someone saying they can't enter the poll. If you can't enter the poll, you can pop it in the chat if you like.
Yeah, Becky, there are quite a few people, well, a number of people that can't see the poll. I'm just wondering if it's not available on some phones or
that's a shame.
Something.
Yeah. Sorry, guys.
Well, hopefully this gives us a good sense of proportions. And then, yeah, as Becky said, feel free to put your responses in the chat as well. Okay, well, I'll move on and kind of flesh those out. Oh, I forgot to move to the poll slide. Sorry about that. Yeah, so if you want to respond in the chat, whether you've responded to a planning consultation, participated in the neighborhood plan, or joined and organized a campaign. So there are a lot of avenues that you can take to protect your local wildlife from development. So one of the things you can do is get involved in your parish council, particularly around the neighborhood plan. So as I've talked about, it's a great way to help shape your parish and make sure that development in your area is sustainable and beneficial to your local environment. So another option in the face of a really damaging development is to set up a campaign. So we've seen this be really successful in cases like the Danes Moss campaign that the community set up, where a big housing development was stopped because of public backlash, and the council was forced to reassess that piece of land. The Adlington Newtown is another example, another very recent one, where several community campaigns have been set up, and obviously the outcomes of that are yet to be determined, but it's a good way to put pressure on decision makers to do the right thing. So a few important things to consider when campaigning is that there's strength in numbers, so you'll be much more successful as a group than alone. You also want to make sure that you have a few key messages so that the campaign stays focused, and you want to make sure that any demands that you set are realistic. And then one of the most effective ways to get any campaign goals really is to talk to those who make decisions. So your councillors and MPs, they're the ones to target. So my colleague Faye is our campaigns officer, and she's currently in the process of making some guides with some more information and advice around campaigning, which I'm sure Becky will be sending out in her newsletter when they've been uploaded to our website. And then finally, I'd really recommend responding to planning consultations, although it sounds like that's kind of what most people are doing already. So consultations both for development applications and also for local plans and policies. It's a really underrated form of participating in shaping your local environment, and it can have a big impact. So you can look at the documents that the developers have submitted on the planning portal. So if you feel confident, you can have a look at the B&G documents, ecological reports, and identify impacts to priority habitats and species. So one of the big things to keep in mind is what we call material considerations. So those are the factors that the planning officer must take into account in their decision. So anything to do with going against policy is a material consideration, drainage and flood risk, effects on trees, etc. But some things are considered non-material considerations. So like losses of views, construction noise or disturbance during development. Unfortunately, the planning officer cannot take into account the fact that you don't want a housing development behind your house. So definitely worth it to stick to those material considerations, which will add a lot more weight to your objections. And I also made some planning resources last year, which Becky will mention in a bit, which go into more detail around a lot of the things I've talked about today, the planning system and BNG. And then I also have a guide on responding to planning applications, which you can have a look at. And then finally, you can just email our planning team at the email on the slide. So please, please include as many details in your email as possible, especially if it refers to a specific planning application. The planning application reference number is the #1 most useful piece of information. And then the postcode and any species and habitats you're particularly concerned about. I will just caveat this by saying that we are a small team. Currently, I'm the only one dealing with planning, and we have limited resource and capacity just as a charity. So I can't guarantee that we can respond to every application that we get asked about. And we also have certain criteria to assess whether to get involved because, as you can imagine, if someone comes to us because they're concerned about some development on arable fields that have some common species, we cannot make that a priority over the big solar farm that's going to destroy a whole local wildlife site. That said, we encourage anyone to contact us anyway. A lot of the applications I do respond to, I was alerted to by a member of the public, so your concerns are very useful to us. And then you can also email us with general questions around planning and wildlife, and we'll try to answer you as much as we can. So I know that was a lot to go through, so thanks so much for coming to listen today. And now I'm happy to take any questions in the chat.
Thank you so much, Melusine. That was really interesting. That was an absolute whistle-stop tour. You covered so much, which is great. Yeah, I think some of the main takeaways for me was the fact that a lot of the work that you work on has been brought to your attention by just members of the public raising their concerns. That is amazing. And also some really good tips about actually when you do contact Cheshire Wildlife Trust, like just to, you know, include as much information as possible. So yeah, thank you so much. I've got some questions that were submitted before the webinar, which I'll start with, but if people want to add some extra questions in the Q&A, I can see loads in there already. We will try and get through as many as we can, or as many as Melusine's happy to go through. Also, just to mention that I'm sure many of you have really specific planning questions about really specific developments, which is great. However, maybe for this webinar, it'd be great if we might have to choose some questions that would be of benefit to the majority of people on this call. But if you do have really specific questions, like Melusine says, contact the planning email. So first question, Melusine. How can wildlife data be used effectively to object to large-scale housing developments within local areas?
Yes, so that's a point that I'm glad to be able to make now because I didn't quite get to fit it in. So when developers are looking to put in a planning application on a site, they are required to do a lot of background research on what's already there. So they get ecologists to survey the site for habitats, and they also have to figure out what species are already there. And so they go to Record, which is our local record center for Cheshire. They collect species data submitted by truly anyone. And they kind of keep that data, and then so they're the ones that developers go to do this kind of desk-based assessment. So if you see particularly priority species in your area or anywhere that's threatened by development, it's really useful if you can submit those records to Record. And honestly, even if there's no imminent danger from development, it might be useful later down the line. You never know. And it's just good for them to have that data. So we encourage people to submit their species data, and then it's useful. It's useful for us as well because we can sometimes we have access to that data and we can have a look at what's already there. And we want our objections to be evidence-based as much as they can. And so having that information is really useful.
Amazing. Thank you very much. And yeah, it just goes to show another way to help just by recording the wildlife you see. Thank you very much. Okay, next question. Do you think planning law should make a distinction between managed green spaces and wilder areas? Is there sufficient value given to blue space as well as green?
So this is a really big question. And to me, this is going to be kind of more of a discussion than an answer. But there are lots of different designations out there for, let's say, sites that aren't developed on. So there are landscape designations, and there's the green belt designation, obviously, and there are local wildlife sites. So for wildlife, there's kind of a hierarchy of designated sites. We have locally designated sites, and then we have nationally designated sites, and then there's a hierarchy within that as well. It's kind of hard to figure out, where to draw the line between landscape and wildlife areas, for example. But we, as a wildlife trust, kind of have to focus on the wildlife, on the species and the habitats. So one of the things we do, if there's if we get asked about a development that is more likely to impact the green belt or the countryside, we have friendly ties with CPRE, which are the Campaign to Protect Rural England. And so sometimes it might be that they're better placed to object against a development than us, because if it doesn't involve priority species and habitats, it's not something that we can really spend our time on and focus our energy on. So it's kind of a minefield of designations out there. So we kind of have to focus on the ones that are specifically for wildlife, biodiversity, and kind of nature in general. There's a second part to that question actually about blue space, which is really interesting. And again, I don't know that I have an answer for that necessarily. But blue spaces are kind of an interesting term because they also really depend on whether they are managed for biodiversity, for example, because I've definitely seen stretches of canals that don't have a whole lot of habitats around them, whereas other stretches of canals are we've managed to get designated as local wildlife sites because they're extremely important for wildlife. So it kind of, in that sense, it kind of comes down to management and just how much they're being used by wildlife.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thanks for explaining that, Melissa. A quicker question for you. What is the smallest development you have advised on?
Well, as I kind of mentioned earlier, I have sent in an objection to, I think the smallest one was an agricultural shed, and that's because it was on a local wildlife site. And for us, any development really on a local wildlife site is kind of has to be a priority, because I haven't really gone into detail around this, but local wildlife sites are locally designated sites that are important for wildlife. And we actually did a webinar around local wildlife sites in the summer or the spring that should be available on our website somewhere, so feel free to ask about that. But so those are kind of, we manage the system of local wildlife sites, and we are the main advocates for them. And so if there's anything so much as a plank of wood being nailed down on a local wildlife site. We have to at least look into it. And sometimes it's just about contacting the landowner and seeing what it is that they're actually going to be doing and whether it's going to be damaging to the local wildlife site and the features that it's designated for. But that's definitely at least something that we have to look into.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. We've got a question here that says, how well do professional local planning officers understand the wildlife conservation issues, in your opinion, or from your experience?
That's a big question. It depends on so many factors, obviously. I mean, from a certain point of view, it depends on kind of their interest in nature. It also depends on the local authorities. So we cover 8 local authorities. So that's Wirral, Halton, Warrington, Cheshire East, Cheshire West, Trafford, Tameside, and Stockport. Hopefully I haven't forgotten any of them. And Cheshire East and Cheshire West have a really solid team of biodiversity officers who essentially do very similar work to mine in terms of assessing planning applications for their impacts on wildlife, and we work closely with them. Some local authorities don't have biodiversity officers, but some in the most, if not all, in the Greater Manchester area defer to the Greater Manchester Ecology Unit. So I think it's hard for me to say, obviously, whether the planning case officers know what their level of interest and knowledge in biodiversity is. I think the ones with their own in-house ecologists tend to, I assume, kind of know a bit more and be more aware. And then I think that the biodiversity net gain legislation, which is only a few years old really, helps quite a bit as well, because the planning officers have to take into account the biodiversity because it's a statutory requirement. So they have to look at the metric and assess the reports, at least for the smaller schemes, which the biodiversity officers don't have capacity to look at. So how informed that assessment is, I can't really say. But I've found generally that when I reach out to planning case officers to discuss the ecology around an application, they're generally pretty happy to talk to me.
That's good. That's good. But yeah, it sounds like it really varies.
Oh, did I click that?
That's all right. I think we've got time for a few more questions, if that's okay,
Yeah,
if you're
go
happy
for
with
it.
that. Someone has said, I have fought many planning applications, even those hidden from most people. We got permission of a landowner to buy their agricultural land. We were looking at a community land trust to protect it. We also want to rewild it with support. Unfortunately, it didn't get off the ground. How would you approach a similar scheme to rewild and protect areas of greenbelt?
Interesting. I think there are lots of different components to that question. It can definitely be tough to kind of get something like that off the ground. I've heard of community led projects for rewilding or managing habitats in certain spaces that were required to go through the planning system to get it off the ground, and then they were constrained by submitting a planning application. I've even seen these kinds of schemes, even internally sometimes, where we want to do habitat creation and the local authority asks us to do B&G on the habitat creation work that we're doing. So that can definitely be a big barrier. What would I suggest? I'd suggest getting in touch with the local authority if you can, and seeing if maybe they can kind of help you through the process from within. But then otherwise, that's something that you can reach out to us about. We have community officers who can help with that kind of thing. And internally, if I haven't answered your question, one of my colleagues might be able to do that better.
Yeah, brilliant. And just on that, I suppose, if any groups or community groups are thinking about starting community nature reserves, which would be amazing, as part of the Wild Network newsletters, I send lots of upcoming community and environmental grants and funding to apply for. So definitely get in touch if you're interested with that. That sounds wonderful. I think we've got time for maybe I'll choose 3 more questions. There's so many, it's quite hard to choose. So apologies if we don't get around to your question, we'll try and answer it later. Does having great crested newts immediately adjacent to a proposed site, which is an arable field, make the site a priority habitat?
So they're definitely a priority species, and they have to get taken into account in developments. If the development is going to impact their habitat, so usually a pond, but not necessarily, it could be the kind of the grassland around. There's a specific type of licensing, like a specific type of license that they're required to get, where they then sign up to compensate for that habitat loss by creating new ponds. Might be worth looking up district level licensing if you're particularly interested, because I don't have all of the details. But it's definitely an important consideration. That's what we'd call one of the material considerations. And then that's also definitely, if you know that there are great crested newts somewhere specific, that's definitely worth sending over to Record as well.
Yeah, that's good advice. Thank you. A couple more questions. When BNG is created off-site on other land owned by the developer, who checks that they manage it for 30 years? Do you know that?
Oh boy.
Am I choosing all the hard questions? Sorry.
Yeah, no, all the good questions. That's so tough, and I unfortunately do not have much of an answer. One of the big questions around BNG is, once the scheme is in place, it's the monitoring, and the local authorities also have limited capacity and resources, unfortunately. So it is a legal requirement. And so they enter kind of a legal agreement with the local authority or whoever, saying that they will manage the habitat for 30 years. And so they can get pulled up on it if it's clear that they're not doing that. But that might be a question for the local authority, because different ones are going to have different kind of ways about going that, or ways of going about that. But that's something that we've kind of been discussing at the trust as well, is whether we can kind of get involved in monitoring, because the question stands of, if we're putting all of this work objecting to planning applications or getting better results from planning developments, we want to make sure that that work isn't in vain, and that the results of that are actually going to be seen for nature and for wildlife. And I will say BNG is a pretty new legislation, and only started being mandatory in February 2024, though some local authorities had adopted BNG policies, Cheshire East in particular, or no net loss policies before then. But the real legal statutory requirement is as of a year ago. So it'll definitely be really interesting to see in the next 5-10 years whether we're actually seeing that the developers are doing their bit and doing what's required of them.
Yeah, absolutely. It'd be really interesting to see some results in the next few years because obviously, like you say, it's such a new thing. Thank you very much. I'm going to ask one more question and then we'll slowly wrap up. Someone has said, "Hi, Melusine. How do you feel about the Planning and Infrastructure Act and the threat this potentially poses to nature recovery?"
Another big question. I I don't have all of the details on that. It's also, once again, that kind of remains to be seen. You know, legislation is one thing, and the way that it's implemented is another. We definitely campaigned kind of within our advocacy team at our trust to get better results from the bill, and our central team at the wildlife trusts did a lot of advocacy work at the national level to try to get better results. They were kind of mixed. There were definitely, I think, some disappointments. And so we will have to see kind of how that pans out. We do have some information on our website about our response to that and kind of discussing the implications of it. So definitely go to our website, and if you type in planning and infrastructure, either act or when it was still a bill, hopefully you'll get a more specific answer to your question.
Thank you very much. And yeah, I can definitely link that in a follow-up email after this webinar. Melusine, thank you so much. That was so interesting. And I hope everyone on this call now feels a bit more confident, or at least knows a lot more about how the policy and all the planning works when it comes to new developments. Thank you very much. But
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Before we wrap up, I just wanted to draw everyone's attention to some really useful resources on our website, and just give you an idea about what they include inside. And again, I will send the links out in the next few days. And if you're watching this on catch up, you'll be able to find them in the caption on YouTube. So the first one is how to engage with the planning system to protect nature. This includes loads of advice on how to respond to an application and what policies and laws exist, which is really useful. The middle one, we've got understanding the law and protections. This includes a really long list of priority birds, habitats, and species that can be found here in Cheshire. And then you've also got a guide to understanding BNG, which explains BNG in a really, really accessible way. And there's lots of BNG information for both developers and land managers on there. So please use these resources, share them on your social media, send them to new campaigners in your group, or people just share them where you want. Also, I mentioned at the beginning, there are a few ways you can get more involved in helping Nate through something called the Wild Network. Like I said, this is a network of people from across Cheshire and Wirral who just want to see wildlife recover and are actively involved in local conservation, which is amazing. We've got a new community map tool, which you are welcome to use. Hopefully you can help find some local environmental projects. At the minute, I think we've got 140 different community groups on there, so surely there is something in your area. I really hope there would be. We're of course always on Facebook, Cheshire's Wild Network. You're welcome to share advice or ask for advice or help with projects. That's absolutely fine. And I also send out a monthly newsletter, which you might have done through this webinar, and if not, you can do that on our website. But that's probably the best way to find out about everything that's going on. All these webinars, workshops, lots of environmental funding, just generally loads that you can get involved in. Like I said, something hopefully for everyone. And then finally, we've got a couple more of these webinars coming up. Again, head to the events section on the Cheshire Wildlife Trust website to see how you can register for free. We've got one on creating a space for butterflies and why caterpillar food plants matter. And we've got a part 2 of careers in conservation, so you can explore what it might be like to spend a day working in conservation. And that's it. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Huge thanks to Melusine for giving up her evening to educate us all on how planning policy can make quite a huge difference in protecting wildlife, which I'm sure many people on this call want to do. In the next few days, I'll upload this recording to our YouTube channel in case you want to have a look through anything. And yeah, that's it. Thank you so much again. It is 1 minute to 8, bang on time, which is great. So yeah, I hope to see you all at another webinar very soon. See you later.